Imagine a treasure. Not just a chest of pirate gold, but the entire fortune of a nation, the gold reserve of a giant empire. Hundreds of tons of pure gold capable of changing the course of history, buying armies and overthrowing governments. Now, imagine that this treasure simply vanishes. It disappears into the smoke of a civil war, leaving behind only legends, accusations, and dozens of unsolved mysteries. This isn't the script for an adventure movie. This is the true story of the Russian Empire's gold reserve, which in 1917 became the most desired and most cursed treasure in the world. Where did this immense wealth go? Who took possession of it, and why are the echoes of this gold rush still heard today? Today, we will embark on a journey to trace the path of the lost gold, and I promise you, the end of this story will be astonishing. So, the year is 1917. The Russian Empire is collapsing, first the provisional government, then the Bolsheviks. Chaos, war, the country is falling apart. And in the vaults of the state bank in Petrograd, Kazan, Samara, and other cities, it is kept, the gold reserve. At the time of the revolution, it was estimated to be around 1,300 tons of gold. To give you a sense of scale, that's more than the gold reserves of many modern countries. In a situation where the old money had turned into worthless paper, this gold was the only hard currency, the key to power and victory in the coming civil war. The Bolsheviks understood this perfectly, but their opponents, the whites, were not sleeping either. And the center of gravity for everyone became the city of Kazan. Why? Because even before the revolution, during World War I, the Tsarist government, fearing a German advance on Petrograd, had evacuated a significant part of the gold reserve deep into the country, to the quiet and, as it seemed then, safe city of Kazan. Here, in the huge vaults of the Kazan branch of the state bank, about half of the empire's entire gold was stored. Almost 650 tons of bars, coins and jewels. The true heart of the country's financial system. In the summer of 1918, the civil war flares up with new intensity. A powerful anti-Bolshevik front is forming on the Volga River. Units of the People's Army of Komuch, a government created by the socialist revolutionaries in Samara, and detachments of the rebelling Czechoslovak Legion are approaching Kazan. For them, capturing the gold is not just about getting rich. It's a chance to gain international recognition, to buy weapons, equipment, and food. It is a real tool for victory. The Bolsheviks are in a panic. Lenin sends telegram after telegram to Kazan, demanding they hold the city, and most importantly, the gold, at any cost. But it's too late. On August 7th, 1918, after fierce fighting, the Whites and the Czechoslovaks enter Kazan. The first thing they do is rush to the bank vaults. What they saw there stunned even the most seasoned soldiers. Tens of thousands of crates filled with gold bars, old imperial coins, platinum, and other valuables. The treasure had been captured. Imagine that operation. The gold is loaded onto river barges, onto steamships. It didn't just need to be counted, it needed to be moved out from under the nose of the Reds, who could launch a counter-offensive at any moment. The security was provided by the Czechoslovak legionaries. For them, this gold had also become a kind of guarantee for their own future, a ticket home to an independent Czechoslovakia, which the Entente countries had promised them. The gold is transported to Samara, then to Ufa, and as the Reds advance further east into Siberia, to Omsk, which at that time had become the capital of White Russia. It is here, in Omsk, that Admiral Alexander Kolchak seizes power, proclaimed the supreme ruler of Russia. And along with power, he also gets the gold reserve. Now he is the keeper of the immense treasure. People look at him with hope and envy. After all, he held a financial tool of incredible power. Kolchak could buy the support of world powers, arm his army to the teeth, and seemingly decide the outcome of the civil war. But gold, as is often the case, turned out to be not only a gift, but a curse. First, it had to be managed properly. And how do you do that when all state institutions have completely collapsed? Kolchak's government was extremely unstable, rife with corruption and intrigue. Officials and military officers tried to grab their piece of the pie. Second, the world powers, Britain, France, the USA, Japan, were in no hurry to help Kolchak just for the sake of it. They were pursuing their own interests. They sold weapons and ammunition at exorbitant prices, demanding payment in pure gold. And the gold began to flow abroad. For example, there's a well-known case where representatives of an American bank essentially deceived Kolchak's government, forcing it to place part of the gold in their vaults under the pretext of safekeeping, while in reality using it for their own speculation. Contracts for arms supplies were concluded on crippling terms. Rifles that were worth pennies were sold to the whites for pounds of gold. Locomotives, which were essential for supplying the army, were purchased at prices dozens of times higher than the market rate. The result was a paradoxical situation. Kolchak was sitting on a mountain of gold, but his army was still poorly clothed, poorly armed, and often starving. The gold reserve was melting away before their eyes, while providing less and less real benefit. Some of the gold was simply stolen. There are many stories about how individual officials and officers with access to the treasury fled abroad with suitcases full of gold. But the main expenses went to the war. According to various estimates, during Kolchak's rule, between 200 and 300 tons of gold were spent and sent abroad. This is a colossal amount. But even that did not save the white movement. By the end of 1919, Kolchak's army was defeated, and the Reds were advancing rapidly. A panicked retreat to the east began, which went down in history as the Great Siberian Ice March. And along with the remnants of the army, with refugees, with the wounded, in frozen railway cars, travelled what was left of the gold reserve, about 28 train cars with the precious cargo. This golden echelon became the last hope and the main headache for the retreating forces. So, we see that the first, largest part of the gold reserve, having fallen into the hands of the whites, did not become a panacea. Instead of becoming the foundation for the revival of Russia, the gold turned into a bone of contention, a source of corruption, and an object of predatory interest for both internal and external players. It paid for a fratricidal war, flowing abroad and enriching foreign dealers. The main conclusion of this stage is simple. Wealth itself solves nothing. Without a strong state, without a clear plan and honest executors, any treasure turns to dust. The story of Kolchak's gold is a clear example of how, holding all the trump cards, you can ultimately lose the game. But this is only the beginning of our investigation. The fate of the gold that went with Kolchak on his final journey turned out to be even more dramatic and confusing. And the key role in it was played by the very soldiers who had once helped to capture it, the Czechoslovak legionaries. The beginning of 1920. Siberia. The white movement is in its death throes. The remnants of Admiral Kolchak's army, exhausted by frost, typhus, and constant battles with partisans, are rolling back further and further east along the Trans-Siberian Railway. The golden echelon moves with them. Now it is no longer a symbol of power, but a heavy burden and a mortal danger. Everyone is hunting for the gold, the Reds, partisans, local warlords, and even yesterday's allies. And the main players on this section of the Trans-Siberian were the Czechoslovaks. The same Czechoslovak legion that helped capture Kazan in 1918. By 1920, they no longer wanted to fight for the whites. Their only goal was to return home, to their new independent country, and they controlled the railway. In fact, without their permission, not a single train could move. In this situation, Admiral Kolchak and his golden echelon found themselves hostages of the Czechs. In January 1920, a key event takes place at the Nizhnoudinsk station. Under pressure from the Allies, primarily the French, and in exchange for guarantees of safe passage to the east, Admiral Kolchak hands over the golden echelon to the control of the Czechoslovaks. And shortly thereafter, in Irkutsk, the Czech command hands over the admiral himself to the local socialist revolutionary Menshevik political centre, which in turn hands him over to the Bolsheviks. On February 7, 1920, Admiral Kolchak was executed on the bank of the Angara River. And the gold? The gold remains with the Czechoslovaks. They take it with them further to Vladivostok. Lenin's Bolshevik government is, of course, furious. It demands the immediate return of the stolen national heritage. Difficult negotiations begin. Soviet Russia is still weak and cannot fight the well-armed Czechoslovak corps. The Czechs, in turn, understand that they will not be allowed to simply sail away with the Russian gold. In the end, a compromise was reached. In exchange for an unimpeded evacuation from Vladivostok, the Czechoslovak command agrees to return the gold to the Soviet government. An official transfer takes place. A Soviet commission accepts the echelon. The recount showed that there was gold worth about 409 million gold rubles. This is approximately 315 tons. If we recall that about 650 tons were taken from Kazan, a reasonable question arises. Where is the rest? Where did almost half of the gold reserve go? Part of it, as we have already said, was spent by Kolchak on purchasing weapons and maintaining his army. Some was stolen, but there is also the so-called Czech version. Many historians and publicists, especially in the West, claim that the Czechs did not return everything, that they still hid and took some of the gold with them. This gold allegedly became the foundation for the creation of the gold reserve of independent Czechoslovakia and the basis of its financial system. Let's look into this. A specific example often cited by supporters of this theory is the creation of the Legio Banka in Prague. This was a bank founded by former legionaries, and it was indeed very successful. It was said that its initial capital was that very same Russian gold. However, official Czech and Russian documents do not confirm the fact of theft. According to the Transfer Act, signed by both parties, all the remaining gold was returned. Of course, one can assume that some part was stolen at a lower level, by individual soldiers or officers, but to say that the Czechoslovak government centrally appropriated tens of tons of Russian gold, there is no strong evidence for this. Most likely it is a beautiful legend that fits well into the overall picture of chaos and universal robbery of those years. But it shows how strong the temptation was, and how easily entire fortunes could disappear at that time. So the main part of the gold that passed through the hands of Kolchak and the Czechoslovaks eventually returned to the Bolsheviks. But the story does not end there. After all, there was another part of the gold reserve that did not end up in Kazan. For example, the gold that was stored in the banks of Moscow and other central cities controlled by the Reds. Where did they send it? They sent it to fuel the world revolution. Lenin and his associates believed that the revolution in Russia was just a spark that should ignite the flame of a global fire. They actively financed communist parties and revolutionary movements in Europe, primarily in Germany. Tens, if not hundreds, of millions of gold rubles were secretly smuggled abroad to support German communists, to organize strikes, uprisings, and to buy weapons. It was an all-in bet. The Bolsheviks were ready to sacrifice their national heritage for their main ideological goal. A telling example is the so-called Gold of the Comintern. The Communist International, created in 1919, was, in essence, the headquarters of the world revolution, and its activities were generously paid for from the Russian reserves. Gold was smuggled via diplomatic pouches, through front companies, and settled in Swiss bank accounts. It went to pay for propaganda, to support professional revolutionaries around the world. But the world revolution never happened. The uprising in Germany was suppressed, and the revolutionary wave in Europe subsided, and huge funds were spent in vain. They did not help the European communists come to power, nor did they help the starving peasants in Russia itself, where a terrible famine broke out in the early 1920s. Thus, the second block of our story shows us two different fates of the same treasure. One part of the gold, having passed through the crucible of the civil war in Siberia, returns to the state treasury, but at the cost of enormous losses and sacrifices. The other part, which was initially in the hands of the Bolsheviks, is purposefully spent by them on the implementation of a utopian idea, dissolving in political adventures abroad. The conclusion here is also obvious. Gold itself has no ideology. It is only a tool. In the hands of some, it becomes a means for waging war. In the hands of others, fuel for a world revolution. But in both cases, it serves destruction, not creation. The fate of the gold reserve at this stage is a tragedy of a national treasure that was thrown to the wind for the sake of phantom goals, while the country itself lay in ruins. But there were still other parts of the gold reserve, those that had been sent abroad even by the Tsarist government. Their story is a true detective novel involving banks, spies, and international courts. We have traced the fate of the majority of the gold reserve inside Russia. But there was another, very significant part of it that had left the country even before the revolution. During World War I, the Russian Empire was an ally of Britain and France in the Entente. The war required colossal amounts of money, primarily for the purchase of weapons, gunpowder, and uniforms. Russia placed military orders in British, American, and Japanese factories, and as collateral for loans and for direct payment of these orders, the Tsarist government sent its gold for storage in Western banks, primarily to the Bank of England. According to various estimates, gold equivalent to several tens of billions of modern dollars was sent there. This was the so-called military gold. And then 1917 happens, the Tsar is overthrown, the Bolsheviks come to power, and in 1918 they cancel all Tsarist debts. They declare, "We are a new country, we owe nothing to anyone." It seems like a logical step from their point of view. But the Western creditors, governments and private banks, thought differently. They said, "Excuse me, but what about the gold that we hold as collateral? Since you do not recognize the debts, we will confiscate this gold as payment." And they did. The British government simply seized all Russian assets, including the gold reserve held in the Bank of England. For the young Soviet Russia, this was a devastating blow. The country desperately needed money to restore its ruined economy, and its legitimate reserves were frozen. A long and exhausting struggle for the return of this gold began. The Soviet government filed lawsuits in international courts, conducted negotiations, and tried to reach agreements. A classic example is the Lena Goldfields case. This was a British company that had developed gold mines in Siberia before the revolution. After being nationalized by the Bolsheviks, it filed a lawsuit against the Soviet government for a huge sum, and the international arbitration sided with it. To get its accounts of merchant ships abroad unfrozen, the Soviet government eventually had to agree to a settlement and pay the company massive compensation. And there were many such stories. Almost all the military gold sent to England and other countries was used to pay off the Tsarist debts that the Bolsheviks themselves had refused to recognize. It was a vicious circle. But there was another interesting story related to gold abroad. This is the so-called gold of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In March 1918, to get out of World War I, the Bolsheviks signed a separate peace treaty with Germany. The terms were humiliating. Russia lost huge territories and had to pay Germany a giant indemnity, 6 billion marks. Part of this sum, 98, 5 tons of pure gold, was sent to Germany in several echelons in September 1918. It was a desperate decision, but Lenin was willing to do anything to get a respite and hold on to power. However, the story then takes a sharp turn. Just 2 months later, in November 1918, a revolution takes place in Germany itself. Kaiser Wilhelm is overthrown. The German Empire, to which the Bolsheviks had just paid tribute, ceases to exist, and to top it off, Germany loses the war to the Entente. And under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, all the Russian gold received by Germany under the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was to be handed over to the victors, primarily France, as reparations. And it was handed over. That is, the Russian gold that the Bolsheviks gave to the Germans to get out of the war ended up with the French. France, in turn, announced that it would use this gold to pay off the same Tsarist debts to French investors. The circle closed again. The gold was gone forever. Thus, the third part of the gold reserve, which was located abroad, was lost almost completely. It became a bargaining chip in a great geopolitical game. It was confiscated to cover debts, handed over as indemnity, and eventually dissolved in the vaults of Western banks. The conclusion of this block: in the world of high politics and big money, naivety and ideology do not work. By renouncing the obligations of the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks themselves gave their opponents a reason and a legal basis for confiscating the national reserves. The gold that was supposed to serve the country's development instead went to pay old bills, becoming the price for the political mistakes and adventures of the new regime. The story of the Tsarist gold abroad is a lesson that financial sovereignty and international trust are earned over decades, but can be lost in an instant. So, let's sum things up. What happened to the gold reserve of the Russian Empire, one of the largest in the world at the beginning of the 20th century? It shared the tragic fate of the country itself. It was fractured, plundered, spent on a fratricidal war and a world revolution, and confiscated by foreign powers. Of the approximately 1,300 tons that Russia had at the time of the revolution, by the mid-1920s, when Soviet power was finally established, no more than 300 to 400 tons remained in the treasury, according to the most optimistic estimates. Where did 1,000 tons of gold go? Let's trace the paths one more time. The first and largest part was Kolchak's gold. It was captured by the whites, partially spent on weapons, partially stolen, and what was left after a long and arduous journey returned to the Soviet treasury. But far from all of it returned. These were the largest and most direct losses during the Civil War. The second part was the gold of the Comintern. The portion of the reserves that was initially controlled by the Bolsheviks was deliberately spent to support communist movements abroad. This money simply burned up in the furnace of a world revolution that never happened. The third, no less significant part, was the gold placed abroad by the Tsarist government. It was seized and used by the West to pay off the debts of the Russian Empire, which the Bolsheviks had renounced. And finally, the fourth part was the gold of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was paid to Germany as indemnity and then fell into the hands of France. The fate of the gold reserve is a mirror that reflects the entire tragedy of Russia in the 20th century. It is a story of how material values depreciate when state institutions and moral guidelines are destroyed. The gold that had been accumulated for centuries, that was supposed to become the foundation of the nation's prosperity, overnight turned into an instrument of destruction, a source of temptation, corruption, and political blackmail. It was divided, stolen, sold for a pittance, used to pay for weapons to kill their own countrymen. This story is a stern warning. It teaches us that a nation's true wealth is not the tons of yellow metal in vaults, but peace, stability, a strong state, and wise governance. When these are absent, even the greatest treasure turns into a cursed hoard that brings nothing but misfortune. Disputes about the fate of the Tsar's gold continue to this day. New versions appear, some documents surface, and there are calls to return what was stolen. But the truth is that most of this gold has long been melted down, sold, and integrated into the global financial system. Tracing it is now practically impossible. It has become part of a legend, part of our complex and dramatic history. Thank you for watching this video to the end. This is a very complex and multifaceted topic, and I have tried to present only the key facts. If you found it interesting, please be sure to give it a like. It really helps promote the channel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss our next historical investigations. And in the comments, let us know what other mysteries of history you would like us to solve together. What topic would be interesting to you? Your opinion is very important to me. All the best, and see you next time.